I agreed to the camping trip for reasons I did not explain to anyone, not even to myself. My uncle Daniel framed it as a harmless weekend away, a chance to disconnect, breathe clean air, and sit beside a fire without notifications or expectations. I said yes because it felt easier than admitting how heavy everything had become at home. At 26, I was employed, stable, and quietly exhausted by a life that looked complete from the outside. I needed distance, and the woods offered a polite excuse. Daniel invited two of his closest friends, Lucas Bennett and Mark Bennett, a couple he had known for years. They arrived together in a dusty SUV, moving with the ease of people long accustomed to one another. Mark handled logistics with practiced efficiency, unloading supplies and checking lists. Lucas lingered, asking me about the drive, about my work, about things that suggested he was genuinely listening. I noticed the difference immediately, and I hated myself for noticing at all. Lucas was in his early 30s, calm in a way that felt earned rather than effortless. He spoke slowly, choosing words with care, and he had the habit of holding eye contact just a moment longer than necessary. Mark, by contrast, was brisk and grounded, his affection expressed through responsibility rather than language. They functioned well as a unit, and nothing about them appeared broken. That was important. I told myself that repeatedly. The campsite sat beside a narrow river, the sound of water threading through everything we did. Daniel busied himself with setting up tents, narrating his actions as if we were children who needed instruction. Mark joined him without comment. Lucas and I stood nearby, passing stakes back and forth, sharing small observations about the weather and the quiet. It was nothing. It was also the first time in weeks that I felt fully present in my own body. That evening, as the fire settled into a steady glow, conversation drifted toward safer subjects. Daniel talked about work frustrations. Mark complained mildly about city traffic. Lucas asked me why I lived alone. The question landed harder than it should have. I answered honestly, saying I preferred the quiet, leaving out how often that quiet felt like a verdict. Lucas nodded, as if he understood something I had not said aloud. Over the next day, patterns emerged. Mark rose early, focused on plans and timing. Daniel followed his lead. Lucas lingered over coffee, content to sit and watch the river before speaking. When our paths aligned, conversation followed naturally. He asked about my childhood, my mother, the choices that led me where I was. I realized I was offering more than I usually did, not because he pressed, but because he made space that I was careful with my thoughts, or at least I believed I was. I reminded myself that Lucas was taken, that Mark was kind, that Daniel trusted us all implicitly. Still, I began to anticipate moments when Lucas would be nearby, when his attention would settle on me without distraction. It was not desire in any obvious sense. It was recognition, and it stirred something dangerously close to hope. On the second afternoon, Daniel and Mark hiked ahead to scout a trail, leaving Lucas and me behind to prepare lunch. The task was simple and brief, yet I felt an inexplicable tightening in my chest. We worked in silence for a while, until Lucas mentioned that Mark had been distant lately, not unkind, just elsewhere. He said it without accusation, as if stating a weather report. I responded with something neutral, but the admission stayed with me. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed and Mark retired early, Lucas remained by the fire. I joined him, telling myself there was no reason not to. We talked quietly, about nothing urgent, about books we had read and places we had almost visited. The darkness pressed in around us, and the river kept moving, indifferent to the weight gathering in my thoughts. The following morning arrived too quickly, light seeping through the thin fabric of the tent. I woke with the lingering sense that I had dreamed something important and then misplaced it. At breakfast, Mark laughed easily at one of Daniel's stories, and Lucas smiled along, but there was a slight delay before his expression reached his eyes. I noticed it, and again I told myself that noticing meant nothing. As the day unfolded, I became acutely aware of my own restraint. I measured my words, adjusted my posture, kept my gaze appropriately distant. The effort was exhausting. Lucas spoke freely, occasionally brushing past me as we moved through narrow spaces, each accidental contact leaving an echo that lasted longer than it should have. In the afternoon, clouds gathered, heavy and slow, and the air turned still. We sat together under a tarp while rain fell in soft sheets. Daniel dozed. Mark scrolled through his phone, absorbed. Lucas leaned closer to speak over the sound, his voice low and steady. He asked if I was happy. I gave a careful answer, something about being content enough. He did not challenge it, but his expression suggested he heard the distance between my words and the truth. When the rain eased, Mark suggested an early night. As we dispersed, Lucas paused beside me, his tone casual, his eyes searching. He thanked me for the conversation, said it was good to talk to someone who listened. I replied in kind, aware that the exchange carried more weight than it deserved. As he turned away, a quiet certainty settled in my chest. This was no longer just a trip. It was the beginning of something I did not yet know how to name, and I was already afraid of where it might lead. I lay awake that night, listening to the river, understanding that silence itself had shifted, and that whatever followed would demand more courage than I possessed at that moment. Morning arrived with an uneasy clarity, as if the woods had sharpened every thought I was trying to avoid. Ethan moved through the routine of the campsite with practiced normalcy, greeting Daniel, accepting coffee from Mark, nodding at Lucas with a restraint that felt deliberate. The air between them was quiet but alert, charged by what had been left unsaid the night before. Ethan told himself that awareness did not equal intention, that noticing someone did not mean crossing a line. As the day progressed, opportunities for distance dissolved naturally. Daniel suggested splitting tasks again, and Mark volunteered to organize supplies near the car. Lucas and Ethan were left with the slow work of gathering firewood along the riverbank. The walk was unremarkable, yet every step felt measured. Neither spoke at first, as if language itself required permission. Lucas broke the silence by commenting on how different time felt out here, how days stretched without structure. Ethan agreed, admitting that the lack of noise made it harder to ignore his own thoughts. The admission surprised him. He rarely offered vulnerability so freely, yet with Lucas it emerged without resistance. Lucas listened, his attention complete, and that alone felt like intimacy. They sat on a fallen log to rest, the river moving steadily beside them. Lucas mentioned Mark again, this time with more hesitation. He spoke of routines that had become substitutions for conversation, of affection that remained intact but unexamined. Ethan did not encourage the confession, but he did not stop it either. He recognized the danger in that silence, even as part of him leaned into it. Ethan responded by sharing his own pattern of emotional withdrawal, how he kept parts of himself contained to avoid disappointment. He spoke carefully, avoiding specifics, yet the truth was present beneath the restraint. Lucas acknowledged it with a quiet nod, as if recognizing a familiar shape. The moment lingered longer than necessary, their conversation suspended in something neither named. Back at the campsite, Mark noticed nothing unusual. He joked easily with Daniel, accepted the firewood, and thanked them both. Ethan watched the exchange with a growing sense of unease. Mark's trust felt undeserved, and that realization settled heavily in his chest. He began to understand that guilt did not require action, awareness alone was enough to fracture something essential. That afternoon, Daniel proposed a longer hike, eager to explore further trails. Mark agreed enthusiastically, but Lucas hesitated, citing fatigue. Ethan surprised himself by offering to stay back as well. The decision was framed as practical, almost casual, yet the implications were immediate. When Daniel and Mark disappeared down the path, the space they left behind felt suddenly vast. Lucas and Ethan sat near the fire pit, the remains of the morning's warmth still clinging to the stones. Conversation resumed slowly, circling safer topics at first. Lucas spoke about his career, the compromises he had made for stability. Ethan listened, sensing the careful balance Lucas maintained between responsibility and longing. When Lucas asked about Ethan's relationships, the question carried a weight that felt intentional. Ethan admitted he had never allowed himself to want too much from anyone. He spoke of endings that occurred before beginnings could take shape. Lucas responded with a softness that bordered on regret, saying that wanting did not always lead to loss, but avoiding it guaranteed emptiness. The words lodged themselves in Ethan's thoughts, unsettling and compelling. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation deepened without conscious decision. They spoke of fear, of the quiet disappointments that accumulate when needs remain unspoken. Each confession felt reciprocal, carefully balanced, as if they were negotiating an unspoken agreement. Ethan felt himself stepping closer to a boundary he had not known existed until now. When Lucas paused, his gaze fixed on the fire pit, Ethan sensed a shift. Lucas admitted that he felt more understood in those moments than he had in months. He clarified that he loved Mark, that commitment was not in question, yet something essential had been missing. Ethan's response came too quickly, offering reassurance he had no right to give. He realized then that he was no longer neutral. The sound of footsteps on gravel startled them both. Daniel and Mark returned earlier than expected, laughing about a wrong turn. Lucas leaned back, the moment dissolving instantly, but its residue remained. Ethan felt exposed, as if his thoughts had been briefly visible. He avoided Mark's eyes, suddenly aware of how fragile his composure had become. Dinner passed with polite conversation. Ethan contributed where expected, laughed when appropriate, but his attention kept drifting. Lucas was quieter now, more contained, yet his occasional glances carried a familiarity that felt earned too quickly. Ethan understood that something had shifted irreversibly, even if nothing tangible had occurred. That night, after Daniel retired, Mark joined Lucas briefly before heading to bed, tired from the hike. Lucas lingered again by the fire, though this time he did not invite Ethan explicitly. Ethan joined him anyway, drawn by an impulse he no longer attempted to justify. The night was cooler, the fire smaller, their voices subdued. Lucas spoke first, acknowledging the tension without naming it. He said he felt conflicted, aware that lines were blurring in ways that frightened him. Ethan admitted he felt the same, that the closeness had taken him by surprise. Neither suggested stepping away. Instead, they examined the feeling as if understanding it might contain it. Lucas confessed, almost reluctantly, that he thought about Ethan during moments he should have been fully present elsewhere. The admission was quiet, lacking drama, but its impact was immediate. Ethan felt the weight of the words settle between them, heavy and undeniable. He understood that this was the moment where restraint mattered most. Ethan did not reach out. He did not speak words of encouragement or rejection. He simply stayed, letting the confession exist without interruption. In that silence, something essential crossed from possibility into reality. Lucas exhaled slowly, as if relieved and burdened at once. The fire burned low, and neither moved to add wood. Ethan realized that by remaining, by allowing the confession to stand unchallenged, he had participated in something that could not be undone. As he finally stood to leave, the knowledge followed him like a shadow. An emotional line had been crossed, quietly and irrevocably, and the night closed around that truth, leaving him uncertain of what morning would demand. Morning arrived without relief. Ethan woke with the uneasy awareness that something had shifted permanently, even though nothing visible marked the change. The campsite looked the same, the river steady, the air cool and indifferent. Yet the quiet now felt crowded with unspoken consequences. He moved slowly, careful not to draw attention to himself, aware that restraint could no longer undo what had already formed. Lucas emerged from his tent later than usual, his expression composed but distant. When their eyes met briefly, there was recognition and restraint layered together. Mark followed soon after, cheerful and unaware, asking Daniel about breakfast plans. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest as Mark spoke easily, trusting the stability he believed surrounded him. That trust felt heavier than accusation. Throughout the morning, Lucas maintained a deliberate distance. He focused on tasks, spoke when necessary, and avoided prolonged eye contact. Ethan understood the effort it took. Distance, he realized, was not an absence of feeling but a discipline imposed too late. The restraint only sharpened Ethan's awareness of how deeply the previous night had embedded itself in his thoughts. As they packed equipment and dismantled the campsite, Ethan noticed how often his attention drifted toward Lucas despite his intention not to look. Each glance carried the same question: what now? The absence of answers pressed on him, producing a constant undercurrent of anxiety. He wondered if Mark sensed anything, if proximity alone was enough to betray intention. During a brief break, Mark mentioned future plans, speaking casually about an upcoming trip he and Lucas were considering. His tone was hopeful, practical, built on assumption. Lucas nodded, agreeing without elaboration. Ethan watched the exchange with a growing sense of displacement. He was not part of that future, yet he had inserted himself into its emotional margins. The realization unsettled him. He had not intended to disrupt anything, yet intent no longer mattered. Emotional presence had weight, and secrecy amplified it. Ethan understood that even without physical action, he had become a silent participant in something that demanded concealment. That knowledge lingered, persistent and unforgiving. Later that afternoon, Daniel suggested a final walk along the river before leaving. Mark agreed enthusiastically, but Lucas declined, citing a headache. Daniel hesitated, then proposed that Ethan stay back as well, someone to keep Lucas company. The suggestion felt loaded, though it was offered without suspicion. Ethan agreed, feeling the decision settle into place before he could reconsider. Once alone, Lucas remained quiet for several minutes, his posture closed, his gaze fixed on the water. Ethan waited, resisting the urge to fill the silence. When Lucas finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. He said he regretted burdening Ethan with his confession, that it had been unfair and irresponsible. Ethan listened, recognizing the truth in the words even as part of him resisted them. Ethan responded honestly, admitting that the silence had been his choice as much as Lucas's confession had been. He acknowledged that he should have drawn a boundary and failed to do so. The admission felt necessary, even if it offered no resolution. Lucas absorbed this quietly, his expression reflecting both relief and regret. Lucas said he intended to recommit to his relationship, to address what had been missing rather than escape it. He spoke without defensiveness, as if trying to convince himself as much as Ethan. Ethan believed him, and that belief brought an unexpected ache. It meant that whatever connection had formed between them was already receding, leaving behind only its impact. Ethan told Lucas he understood, that he never expected anything more than honesty. The words were true, but incomplete. He did not admit how deeply the connection had affected him, how it had revealed a hunger he could no longer ignore. Lucas thanked him for his discretion, for not demanding more. The gratitude felt undeserved, and that realization lingered between them. When Daniel and Mark returned, conversation resumed as if uninterrupted. Plans were made, laughter surfaced, and the illusion of normalcy reasserted itself. Ethan participated where expected, yet his responses felt rehearsed. He watched Lucas carefully, noting the subtle effort it took for him to engage naturally with Mark again. The drive back was quiet. Ethan sat in the back seat, observing the dynamic between Lucas and Mark from a distance. They spoke comfortably, shared music, and discussed mundane details. Yet Ethan noticed moments where Lucas's attention faltered, where his responses came a fraction too late. Those pauses spoke volumes. Even if Mark remained unaware that as the city came into view, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and loss. The trip had ended, but its consequences had not. He knew he would not be able to return to his previous emotional neutrality. Something had been awakened, and with it came responsibility. He could no longer claim ignorance or detachment. When they parted ways, Lucas met Ethan's gaze briefly, his expression conveying apology and resolve in equal measure. No words were exchanged. Mark thanked Ethan for coming along, his smile genuine and unguarded. Ethan returned the gesture, acutely aware of how fragile that trust was, and how close it had come to fracture. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself replaying moments from the trip, not with longing alone, but with reflection. He understood now that infidelity was not defined solely by action, but by the quiet redirection of emotional loyalty. He had crossed that line without fully recognizing it, and the knowledge altered how he viewed himself. Ethan did not reach out to Lucas after the trip. He recognized that contact would only reopen something that needed to remain closed. Instead, he sat with the discomfort, allowing it to inform his understanding of intimacy and restraint. The experience had not granted him clarity or closure, but it had stripped away denial. He accepted that some connections exist not to be pursued, but to reveal what has been neglected within ourselves. The camping trip faded into memory, yet its lesson remained immediate and unresolved. Ethan knew that moving forward would require honesty he had long avoided, with himself first. As he settled back into his routine, the quiet returned, but it was no longer empty. It carried the weight of recognition, the knowledge that longing can alter lives even when left unacted. And in that awareness, Ethan understood that the most enduring consequences are often the ones no one else ever sees.